This is Success Stories, a program of the Sorrell College of Business at Troy University that highlights the lives and careers of people who have accomplished great things. I'm Alan Mendenhall, Associate Dean of the Sorrell College of Business and Executive Director of the Manuel H. Johnson Center for Political Economy. My guest today is Dr. Samuel Gregg. Dr. Gregg is the author of this most recent book, The Next American Economy. He's the author of several books, but this is his most recent book. And he is a distinguished fellow in political economy at the American Institute for Economic Research, where he is also a member of the research faculty. Dr. Gregg, thank you for joining me today.
Alan, it's good to be with you.
Well, start by telling me a little bit about the American Institute for Economic Research.
Well, the American Institute for Economic Research is the oldest free market research institute in the United States. It was set up in 1933, so this year, 2023, is its 90th anniversary. And it was set up by a gentleman named Edward Harwood, who was very concerned about what he saw as the problematic economic drift that the United States was undergoing as a consequence of the New Deal and the presidency of Franklin D. Roosevelt. He had made his money by basically predicting that the Great Depression was going to happen. So he was very interested in money markets, but he got very interested in the overall arguments for economic freedom. And as a consequence for that, when he looked around the United States in 1933, he realized that there were very few people at that time who were willing to stand up and say, no, the New Deal policies are a mistake. No, we should be trusting more in American freedom. No, we should be focusing much more upon letting markets work. And this move towards government planning, which wasn't just happening in the United States, of course, at the time. It was happening all over the world, not just because of the Great Depression, but that had a lot to do with it. There were not many people at the time who were arguing against this. But he did, and he wanted an institute that would basically keep making these arguments, relying upon good empirical research about what was going on in the economy, but also good political theory, so good thinking, good ideas about the direction of economic life and how you can and cannot go in certain directions. But he was also interested in questions of political economy. What type of values, what type of norms, what type of principles do we think our economy should embody? And how should these play out in the design of things like economic policy? So today, as I said, we're 90 years old. I head up the political economy wing. That's what I specialize in. We have people who work explicitly on monetary policy. And we also have people who deal very much explicitly with economic policy. So our reach is very much around the United States. We do lots of research of our own, but we also do a lot of educational programming in the case for free markets, but also the broader understanding of the type of society that we want this economy to be built into. And I guess the vision of the Institute in that regard is very much in accordance with the type of vision that the founders of the United States had in terms of the way that they saw the economy fitting into American society at the time and going forward into the future.
To someone who does not know what a research institute does, how would you explain your role, what you do on a day-to-day basis?
Well, my day-to-day is very complicated because it can range from things like churning out an article for a particular magazine or journal or periodical that's asked me to write on a particular theme and they want it there by the end of the day, or if I'm lucky. And other times it involves a fair number of hours spent simply working on longer projects, more detailed projects. And that involves a fair amount of research in the sense of looking at empirical data, but also looking at good economic theory and what that says about a given problem. But also it may involve me talking to journalists who want comment on something like what's going on with the banking industry or what's happening with trade policy. But it also involves education in the sense that AIER and myself and the other research fellows there, we spent a fair amount of time giving lectures around the United States and even outside the United States, but also doing educational programming for undergraduates, graduate students, people doing PhDs in areas ranging from economics to political science to foreign policy, trying to explain to them and outline the case for what you might call the free economy within the context of a society that takes virtue very seriously.
Well, we both know that books typically have a short shelf life these days. They don't retain their popularity for very long. But your book here, The Next American Economy, is still doing very well. Why is it so powerful? What is the narrative that is capturing audiences?
Well, the book came out in October 2022, and I think it's fair to say that I'd spent a lot of time writing and speaking about the issues that the book covers, really for the previous 8 years before it came out. So I think there was a sort of head of steam behind it. That's one thing. But I think the bigger reason why the book is still getting reviews, having podcasts done about it, appearing in different forums, both friendly and unfriendly, all across the country and even outside the United States as well, is because it's dealing with an issue that I think is on many Americans' minds right now, which is the economic future of the country. We've come off a period really beginning, I think, in the mid-1970s where America turned in the direction of free markets, free trade, economic liberalization, globalization, etc. Much of this was associated with the person and the presidency of Ronald Reagan, who famously said government is not the solution, government is the problem. And that was the orthodoxy for certainly American conservatives for a long time, but even some people on the American left as well. People like Bill Clinton, for example, were very much buying into this broad vision of the future is economic freedom. But I think we all know that certainly since the financial crisis of 2008, that the reputation of capitalism and the credibility of free market ideas and free market policies took a major hit as a consequence of the 2008 financial crisis. It's still talked about today as having damaged the reputation of American capitalism. And then we saw throughout the 2010s the rise of what you might call economic nationalism or economic populism on both the right, obviously as personified by people like President Trump, but also on the left as personified by people like Senator Bernie Sanders and Senator Elizabeth Warren. If you look at their economic positions, they're not that different. They're basically skeptical about free trade. All of them want to use the government more in different sectors of the economy. They have more confidence in the capacity of government agencies to undertake any number of economic roles. So that consensus that once existed in favor of free trade and free markets has broken up. And we're now in a position now, I think, where we're either going to go down the path of what I call state capitalism, which I think more or less is the alternative that has emerged in contrast to free markets and free market capitalism. And my book, The Next American Economy, basically says these are the two paths that face us, and we have to make a choice because these paths are incompatible. You can't have free markets and state capitalism at the same time. But I think it also points back, and I think this also explains some of the reasons why the book has got such traction, is there's a realization that underneath these economic arguments, there are a lot of other arguments about what America is meant to be. And the economic arguments, I think they function as a proxy for lots of other of these political and even philosophical arguments. And they're not new, right? Because America has been arguing about things like tariffs, about the role of the government in the economy, going all the way back to the founding. But one of the things I say in the book is that the founders envisaged America, despite all their particular differences about economic policy, they envisaged America as not a European social democracy, as not a society in which the government would be omnipresent. They envisaged America as what the founders called a commercial republic. By that is meant a society in which commerce and trade and mercantile activity assumes a very powerful role, and everyone is in some respect involved in this world of commerce, which is very different from a society that's shaped by feudal relations or a society that's overwhelmingly agricultural in its basis. But the republic side of commercial republic is a reminder that no republic, especially a commercial republic, can last unless there is a certain commitment to certain virtues, certain habits. Commercial virtues, what you might call classical virtues that we associate with the world of Greece and Rome, and as well as religious virtues as well. So I think that is a sort of broader argument that I'm trying to make, and I think this is the reason why the book has gotten so much attention, because it's not just about economics, it's also about these what you call political economy questions, and that is where the debates are in the public square right now in the United States.
Well, we hear arguments from both left and right that we ought to return as a society to the American system. And this is a system predicated on manufacturing, on protectionism, on tariffs. And the argument sort of misrepresents the American founding. People cite Alexander Hamilton's report on manufacturers as sort of the basis for this system. But in that respect, Hamilton was something of an outlier. I believe the American founding, was it not, involved quite a bit of anti-tax, anti-tariff, and different duties and impositions from the British government.
Sure, and even in the case of Hamilton, it's important to remember that two things. One is tariffs were a source of revenue. They were the only source of revenue for the federal government at the time. All countries had tariffs. The question was whether tariffs were primarily, if not solely, a means of raising revenue for the government, or whether tariffs were designed to try and structure the economy in particular ways from the top down. And I think certainly if you look at Hamilton, I think most of his emphasis upon tariffs is upon the very practical question of getting revenue for the federal government. So even in his case, his commitment to some of these more interventionist ideas is much more tepid and much more restrained than some of the arguments that we're having heard about today. But I think if you want an idea of the type of vision that preoccupied most of the founders when it came to the economic future and the political future of the United States, I'd really recommend reading George Washington's farewell address, because the commitment to domestic free trade, and I would argue international free trade on the part of Americans, is unambiguous in this document. But this document also makes the point that this free society with this dynamic, commercially orientated economy had to be a society in which virtue was taken very seriously. Because the argument was, if we're going to have this dynamic commercial freedom, we need restraints so that we don't become a society that is just preoccupied completely with material things. There is life, more to life than just the economy, right? And the founders very much looked at the world the same way. So I think if you read Washington's farewell address, which I talk a lot about in the last part of the book, particularly the last chapter, it's very clear that this commercial republic vision involves a dynamic market, which means it's going to be change. There's going to be constant upheaval in the economy as you have entrepreneurs, as you have lots of open and free competition going on. It's meant to be a dynamic, even to a certain degree, an unsettling economy, because nothing is static. Nothing can remain always the same, at least economically speaking. And in that type of economy, the types of cultural and moral supports that you need can't be those of relativism. They can't be those of where you think, well, everyone just makes up their mind about what's morally good and what's morally evil. No, the essential emphasis of the founders here is that you need this society in which virtue is taken very seriously, because virtuous people are the type of people you want operating and living in a dynamic commercial economy.
Well, and I think Hamilton himself was writing in a specific context that was very different from a 19th century context and very different from our own moment. And his ideas involved the infant industries theory, the idea that nascent nations need to rely on protectionism and tariffs until they achieve economies of scale, at which point they can abandon those protectionist measures and embrace markets and trade.
Of course, they never do. That's the problem.
It's hard to put the genie back in the bottle, isn't it? Well, I want to ask you about your experience studying under John Finnis when you got your doctorate at Oxford University.
So I did my my doctorate on basically natural law theory and economics, and as you can probably tell, I wasn't born in the United States. I was born in Australia, and I did my undergraduate study in Australia.
I thought that was a Missouri accent.
Not quite. And so I was lucky enough to be accepted into Oxford, got a good scholarship to go there to do my doctorate under a gentleman named John Finnis, who's also Australian born. And he's probably, I would argue, the world's leading natural law theorist. He wrote a very important book called Natural Law and Natural Rights back in the early 1980s, which I would argue single-handedly revived natural law as a legal theory and as a legal philosophy, certainly in the context of the secular academy, from which it had more or less been almost banished for a long period of time. But I was very interested in this intersection between, let's call it the economic way of thinking and natural law thinking. By natural law thinking, I mean the work of people like Aristotle, people like Thomas Aquinas, and of course many of the thinkers who were very influential upon the American founding. If you go back to the American founding, you find natural law and natural rights language everywhere. It was simply the way that everyone thought about the world. But not many people have looked at the relationship between economics as a way of thinking, or economic science as it's called, and natural law thinking. Many people thought, well, these really don't have much to do with each other. And I argued in my doctoral thesis that, yes, I think they have a lot to do with each other, both in terms of explaining the explanatory power of economics when it comes to understanding why people do what they do, but also the limits of economics as a discipline in terms of what it can tell us about the world. Because economics, I often say, is really good at telling us things like, if you do that, then this consequence is likely to follow. Economics is very much almost the science of relationships. If you do X, Y will follow. But if you do Y, Z is going to happen. And economists spend a lot of time explaining the logic of relationships in that way. But they can't tell you what you should do, right? They can't tell you economics qua economics. Can't tell you that this is the good and right way to proceed. It might be the efficient way or the most effective way of realizing a particular goal, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the right way, because we're more than just economic beings. We think about things more than just our consumer wants and needs. We think about the good, the true, and the beautiful. And natural law has a lot to say about that. And natural law also says there is moral truth. We can know it through our reason. We can certainly identify good ways of acting and bad ways of acting, and we can apply that type of logic, right reason, recta ratio. We can apply this reasoning to how we think about politics, how we think about our personal lives, and how we think about things like the economy, and even things like international relations. And in fact, natural law was the orthodoxy for centuries, that an orthodoxy that transcended religious differences about how to think about complicated political, moral, social, and economic questions. And in fact, I don't think it's a coincidence that some of the first people who sort of developed what you might call some very basic free market principles were proceeding out of a natural law framework. Now, I think economics has for a long time had very little to do with the world of natural law, but I was interested in reigniting that conversation. And I found it a very fruitful exercise, because I can tell you this, when I'm in a room of economists, I'm constantly rolling my eyes in the back of my head, because I'm thinking, yes, but there are all these moral and normative questions you're not thinking about. And when I'm with a group of philosophers, I'll be thinking, you really probably need to read 1 or 2 books on economics. Cross-disciplinary research comes with its benefits and its frustrations.
Well, I certainly understand those as well. You were with the Acton Institute for a long time before you were with AIER, and I'm curious about how you enjoyed your experiences in a research institute where you had the freedom to pursue lines of inquiry as you wished, and you did not choose to go into the academy where maybe your research would have been more circumscribed, or you had to write for certain journals and for certain rubrics and meet certain metrics and publish and certain things and do things for department heads and for department chairs and for deans. But you sort of enjoyed much more freedom to pursue research questions that you were interested in.
questions that I was interested in, but also questions that were consistent and are consistent with the mission of the particular institute. So both the Acton Institute and the American Institute for Economic Research, they are unabashedly free market and limited government in the way that they look around the world. It's not a place where someone who's a self-described progressive or a self-described socialist for that matter would work, and neither would they be invited to work there, and nor would they probably want to work there, because the mission of the institute is clear. So you have to be committed. That's, in a sense, that's the freedom you give up. You have to be committed to the mission of the institute. So if I was to start writing papers explaining why socialism is a great idea or something like that, I would rightly be fired that day. But I think the broader point you're pointing to is this contrast between what you might call the think tank world and a lot of the academy today. Because I think it's clear, and I think lots of people from across the political spectrum would agree with this. The academy now is highly bureaucratic. There are, in some places, more administrators than there are actual academics. It's not clear in many cases whether academic freedom truly prevails in many of these universities and colleges. Try being an outspoken conservative, or try being an outspoken classical liberal, or try being an outspoken libertarian in a lot of universities, and I think you'll find that you'll shut down pretty quickly. Often not so much explicitly, but usually by pretty bureaucratic means for the most part, right? And I think the other flip side of all this is that I think a lot of people in colleges and universities are in fact constrained in terms of what they can write about, which is ironic, right? Because universities are supposed to be places of learning, free expression, etc. But there's two problems. One, I think, is the way in which people are understood to advance your career. So a lot of people end up writing articles for journals that are read by maybe 2 or 3 people in the entire world. You know, the article itself gets read by maybe 5 or 10 people. That's it, right? But you have to do that if you want to get tenure. You've got to show that you've done whatever number of journal articles, and that's ticking the box. And you have to ask yourself, well, that's very interesting, but one, is it really advancing knowledge? Is it really creating a conversation about important ideas that should be had? And I'd suggest in many cases, no, it's not. In many cases, it's a tick the box type of situation. But the other thing I think is that a lot of people, because they're working very hard to get tenure, they avoid topics that might bring critical scrutiny on political or philosophical grounds. And you can look at some of the very prominent classical liberal and conservative academics in America today, and I can assure you, if you go back and look at some of the earliest things they wrote about, it's very dry, technical stuff that's deeply unoffensive to anyone and maybe important, but probably not read by many people, but it gets them tenure, right? And so that strikes me as a range of very bad, and here's the economist speaking, very bad incentives. And it explains, I think, about a lot about why so much of the academy has become dysfunctional. So just forget about the politics. The bureaucratization of the modern academy, I would argue, is really a major reason why so many of these institutions are dysfunctional today.
Well, you reminded me of somebody once telling me that he had gone and read Tom Wolfe's dissertation. Tom Wolfe, the novelist, the famous novelist, great writer, one of the best writers of our time. And when he read his dissertation, he said, this was the most boring thing I think I've ever had to wade through, and it shows all the problems with academia because this person felt so constrained in his writing. Somebody with such creativity and talent felt so constrained that he had to write in this terrible style for nobody to read. You know, I think that's highly problematic. My doctorate's in English, and so there's still, to some degree, an emphasis on style when you're seeking to publish in a literary journal. Style, there is an element that style matters, but...
well, look, for example, at economics journals today. You open them up, what do you find?
Mathematical modeling.
Models. And what's really interesting about that is that despite the fact that economics as a discipline has become so mathematical, so focused on what I would call essentially econometrics, that a lot of economists know more and more about less and less. And when they use a lot of these models to try and predict certain forms of economic behavior, more often than not, they're wrong, right? And we've seen this. This was a major cause of the major contributor to the financial crisis, to any number of economic meltdowns that we've had. And I think it points back to a different way of doing economics. Let's call it old economics, where you'd pick up an economics journal, a book, and you'd find prose and broad predictions about what was likely to happen, which turned out more or less to be right.
Well, Sam, we're going to have to end it there. It's been a pleasure having you on the show. I'm so glad you could come into Alabama and spend some time here with me. This has been Success Stories, a program of the Sorrell College of Business. I'm Alan Mendenhall, Associate Dean of the Sorrell College of Business and Executive Director of the Manuel H. Johnson Center for Political Economy, signing off. We'll see you next time.